Keep.
Hello, puppies and kittens, and once again, we're doing another matter-of-fact science interview where I talk to a professional scientist about their field. Today, I have Robert Schneiker. I think I said that right. Master of Science, who is a geologist and a geophysicist, and he's personally done some work on the Sphinx and also Gobekli Tepe, which I'm terribly interested to hear about. And we do have some images if you need to show them. I've got them queued up on demand. Mr. Schneiker, tell us, what do you do and what have you got to tell us today?
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit. You're fading out.
Oh, I'm sorry for that. I also need to, somebody's tapping really, really loudly.
I heard that.
Yeah. I think that might have been my wife. My wife, Lilandra, is going to be monitoring the chat, to collect questions and everything as the viewers have questions. She'll be pulling those in, and then periodically in our discussion, 20 minutes to an hour or so, she'll be interjecting those questions from the audience. All right. So can you hear me clearly now?
Yes. Okay. So my background in all of this is I'm a
geologist. Can you mute your microphone?
Can I, excuse me?
I was telling my wife to mute her microphone while she's typing. Oh. I apologize.
So my background is I'm a geologist, geophysicist, and I've got a software package that I developed that's used by regulators and environmental consultants to develop soil cleanup standards. And as part of that process, I teach classes on contaminant transport and fate modeling. And basically, there's a part of it that's for the soil column, which is everyone can imagine rain falling on the ground, picking up some contamination on the way, like a coffee percolator, and then contaminating the groundwater. What people have a really hard time understanding is that sometimes if there's a shallow depth to groundwater, the water can wick up and evaporate at the surface. And when it does, the contaminants would then either precipitate out at the surface or they would volatilize to the atmosphere. And so about 8 years, in December, it'll be 8 years, I was watching NOVA. And it was kind of on in the background while I was doing other stuff. And I saw Mark Lehner, an Egyptologist, an archaeologist, explaining how shallow groundwater is wicking up at the Sphinx. And the salt is concentrating at the surface. And as it does, the salt through time accumulates in the pore spaces. And it causes the rocks, the limestone rock, to flake off, and what kind of looks like at times like giant Pringles potato chips. And I was like, this is perfect. Nobody understands this process. Here's an example of this. So I was just going to write a newsletter and use this as part of my training to explain how this is what's occurring at the Sphinx. Started looking into this to find out that Robert Schoch and John Anthony West are saying that the Sphinx is thousands of years older because of this erosional feature that it has. And I'm thinking, well, no. So I put together an actual geological paper on that and presented it at the Geological Society of America meeting in 2014 up in Vancouver. And but it was very obvious to me that this wicking groundwater is just imprinted on top. This couldn't possibly have created something like the 2 to 3, if not more, feet of erosion that people are claiming at the Sphinx, on the Sphinx body. And I was looking at that going, yeah, I can't understand what's going on here. But what really pissed me off is that Robert Schoch is saying that he presented a paper on it being eroded and that all the geologists agree with him and that the only possible explanation is a lost civilization. And when he says all the geologists agree with him, I was thinking, no, I don't know. I've spoken to a lot of geologists. I have yet to find one who would agree with him.
And you are yourself a geologist and you don't agree. So you made an absolute statement, only needs one exception to prove it wrong.
Exactly. I like the way you think. So I started looking into it and I could not explain why. I had a very difficult time understanding why the Sphinx looks the way that it does. So really frustrated, I decided to start at the very beginning when the rocks were deposited 40 million years ago and follow the history. of the geologic history till today. And along the way, I figured it out. And it took a combination of archaeology and geology for me to figure out what was going on. And it turns out that the rock that the Sphinx is carved from is, well, first I got to make something plain. The Sphinx is not where you think it is. The Sphinx is only 20 meters, 66 feet above sea level. It's only about 15 feet above the level of the Nile. Everyone keeps talking about it as the Giza Plateau. And so you imagine that the Sphinx is sitting up high on some hill, nowhere near any water. But in reality, it's in the Nile floodplain. And
so the Sphinx has been flooded by the Nile?
Yes. But that's not what caused the direct erosion. So imagine, I don't know if I can do this. I was thinking about how, so the Sphinx would be like here, and the Nile is here. And with the floods, there's times that the Nile River would actually flood, but most of the time it would never quite get to the Sphinx, and it would be, what it would do is it would soak the ground. It would follow bedrock fractures and soft bedding planes. And this acidic groundwater would dissolve the limestone. And so by the time that they went to carve the Sphinx about 4,500 years ago, this rock was so soft that using the tools, and they didn't use any sophisticated tools. This is the part that I couldn't figure out for the longest time. So it turns out that the way that they actually carved the Sphinx was to use two-handed pounders, which is just to take a rock about that big around and just smash it onto the limestone, and it flakes off. The other thing that they used was a stone hammer, and that'd be a smaller rock with two sticks tied to put into it, to cut notches, and then tied together with leather, and they would take that and bang on the surface. And so this would flake off the rock. This would create what would look like an eroded surface. And that's what happened at the Sphinx. So by the time that they went to carve it, it's only the middle section of the Sphinx that's that soft. And the head is a much higher quality limestone, and that they actually carved directly. So the Sphinx isn't made the way that everyone always claims that it is. There was a monolith. It was a hybrid from the very beginning, that the head and the lower paws, the rear paws, were carved directly out of the limestone rock. But the center section of the Sphinx body, that was pounded back and then covered with a veneer of hard, high-quality limestone, and that limestone was then carved to create the body of the Sphinx. And since construction, those blocks, like the exposed blocks in the pyramids, they've been looted, and they've been used to build the city of Cairo.
Excuse me. I looked at your presentation, and you're the expert on this. Do you mind if I ask questions every now and again for the audience?
Please do.
Myself? So, from my understanding, what you're saying is that the Giza Plateau isn't a plateau from your. It's an escarpment, right? So
yes.
And then here's the Sphinx down here. There's the pyramid at my elbow, Remy. And they carved into the softer rock that had been flooded by the Nile for the bottom part, and the top part is a better limestone that wasn't flooded as often, perhaps.
Yes. So there's three different layers. Yes, a lot of good questions there. So the Sphinx itself has three different layers. There's a high quality upper layer that's called also the upper building stone, and it is this weather resistant, erosion resistant rock, and it's the reason that the Giza escarpment is there. It's the capstone that protected the rock, the softer rock beneath, from erosion. And it slopes down at about 6 to 10 degrees. And I remember sitting at my hotel looking out at the pyramids and seeing it slope down. And so right where the Sphinx is, they actually had a harbor, and they would unload the granite and the limestone that they quarried across the river. and take it up that gentle slope. And it's right there at the intersection, basically, of that slope with the highest flood levels of the Nile. That's at the spot where the Sphinx is located. I should make it clear that it's not just the Nile that has deteriorated this rock through time. There were times in the past when ocean levels were higher. So the rock that the Sphinx is carved from was actually inundated by an ocean. And there's the Green Sahara period. So the precipitation was falling on the ground and soaking down and weathering the rock that way. So there's 3 different processes. But the Sphinx itself, there's some confusion here. The Sphinx itself was never eroded or by the Nile, because if it did, the sloping rock, I'm exaggerating it here, would have a horizontal cut from the level of the Nile, because the water is going to be level. And you don't see that. And there's people, because it goes in and out the surface, they're saying that itself is proof that there was erosion by water. But that's impossible, because that's following the bedding plane. It's not staying horizontal with the water.
So you mentioned, you mentioned that the Sphinx was carved, what was it, 4,500 years ago?
Yeah.
Okay, and I can understand you being pissed off, because I remember, about 20 years ago myself, seeing these kind of the papers where it was claiming that the Sphinx was like 11,000 years old. And like you said, the guy said that all the geologists agree with me. And I'm thinking, oh, well, if all the geologists agree with him, I guess that must be something. But then what did I know 20 years ago? So
you see, I didn't even know any of that stuff was going on. But yeah, so it's Robert Schoch and John Anthony West. So John Anthony West, looking at some research by another archaeologist, Schwaller, who's kind of one of these avant-garde kind of people. John Anthony West, decided that the Sphinx was eroded by precipitation. And even though he said he found other geologists who were in on this, and they wouldn't speak on it. So it took him many, many years, I think maybe as long as 10 years, until he shopped around and finally found a geologist that would agree with him. And that was Robert Schoch. And the thing is that Robert Schoch, he said when he looked at it, it only took him like 30 seconds, maybe a minute and a half, something like that, to figure out how the Sphinx, that the Sphinx is older. I don't know. It took me years to figure out why the Sphinx looks the way it does. I've been there. I've looked at it. It has been so altered over the years from its original construction, and even just recently, they're still patching it with concrete. So it's impossible to look at it. In fact, the repairs that they've done to it kind of make it look more sophisticated and higher quality than it ever was to begin with, because you're missing all the fractures that are cutting across and such.
When you say that it was carved by the traditional way, you explained how they did the hammering thing on the mid body, but how? And excuse me, somebody made a noise outside, and so our sentry mammal has decided that he has to inform the neighborhood during the podcast of how loud he can bark. Sorry, that's inevitable ever since we got that thing. Somebody just knocked at the door.
That's always going to happen at something like this.
Yeah. So sorry for that.
So have you followed this at all?
I was going to ask you, how did they do the carving? You said the traditional way. How did they do the carving, like in the face, for example?
Oh, good question. So there they actually use copper chisels. And so they use the copper chisels sparingly. They just did that for the detailed work. And so at that point, they were using copper. Sometimes I see they say bronze, but as far as I know, they were copper chisels, and they didn't last very long. And so there's a whole workforce just maintaining the points on the copper chisels as they were working.
I can just imagine trying to use those hammers where the stone with the grooves in it with the two sticks on the other side tied with the leather. Can you imagine constantly having to adjust that?
Oh, yeah.
Like every 11th stroke or whatever, the thing would fall apart.
So one thing that I was thinking of, given your background, is you deal a lot with the creationists. And I mean, I've done that. We have the farmers market here, and I've gone down and I've tried to explain to them how evolution works, or natural selection might be a better term to use for them. And, you get it. They understand what you're saying, and then the next time you see them, they've forgotten everything, and they're back to their same points, even though you've corrected them on that point. So many people think that the people who are following this and believe that the Sphinx is older, they think they're like the creationists, and they're not. I mean, yeah, Graham Hancock, Robert Schoch, John Anthony West, these people are like creationists. They find their little gotcha thing. All right, explain why the Sphinx looks the way it does. Explain why Gobekli Tepe was intentionally buried. They got this thing that they believe can't be answered, at least to their satisfaction. So they're like the creationists, but the people who actually follow John Anthony West and Graham Hancock, they're not at all. There's no Bible. They're quick to change their views. And so that was something that was really, I was thinking of when I was thinking, when I realized I was going to be on your program, is to point out that so many people are dismissing them and saying this is a lost cause. Well, yeah, Hancock and Schoch, they're all lost causes, but their followers are not.
Yeah, I find that with creationists, and especially with professional creationists, there's a determination not to understand. And to a large degree, I mean, a lot of them know that what they believe is not really true. It's make-believe, and they're going to make-believe it anyway. They're believing in an alternative universe or an alternative reality that is based on alternative facts. And they know that what they're saying is lies. They have to. There's no way that you can be a professional apologist for creationists and not know that what you're saying is a lie. And that's why they never concede any point. They can't, right? They put a statement of faith that they can never, ever admit any failure. And so it's the most dishonest position you can possibly have.
That's why they're not like scientists at all, because we're constantly saying, hey, we got that wrong. I mean, and that's getting on to Gobekli Tepe. That was the thing when I was looking at that.
This part is going to be especially fascinating for me, because that was Gobekli Tepe was something I found out about much later, after the thing about the 11,000-year-old Sphinx. I didn't even know there was a Gobekli Tepe until years later, and so I was just always intrigued by that right away. That is connected, for those who don't know, that is connected to the very origin of agriculture. Is that correct?
Well, it predates agriculture.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, that's where I was thinking that for the longest time myself. So I got to tell you how I got onto that story. I mean, first off, the conspiracy theorists, pseudoscientists, whatever you want to call them, they are very big into saying, see, there's this civilization 12,000 years ago that proves that the Sphinx is older. And they're, they're just, to them, Gobekli Tepe was a godsend. But of course, they don't give the facts correct on Gobekli Tepe. They've got a very distorted view on that. And so how did I end up writing an article? Did you see the article in Skeptic magazine?
I did not.
Yeah, so I've got an article in Skeptic magazine, and that's where I really learned what was going on with Gobekli Tepe. And that came out of exchanging a few emails with Michael Shermer regarding his appearance on Joe Rogan. And Graham Hancock was on there, and Randall Carlson. And somewhere along the line, he goes, would you be interested in writing an article? Apparently, he thought I knew something about it. Because at that point, I'm like, I know a little bit. But I sat down and I spent months just really learning everything that I could about Gobekli Tepe. And that's what evolved into that article. Being a scientist, I wanted to make sure that what I'm saying is right. I actually contacted one of the researchers at Gobekli Tepe, Jens Notroff. He was a tremendous help. By the time I got in contact with him, I had an article that had all the points that I wanted, but it didn't really have any true focus to it. And he gave it the focus, and he made me feel comfortable in saying the things that I was saying. But Gobekli Tepe, it turns out that the whole thing there is that they were hunter-gatherers, but they were a very special type of hunter-gatherers. And I remember It didn't take me long at all to find this. There was a researcher, Jack Harlan, he's in the agricultural department at Illinois, and he went to that particular area in Turkey in 1967. And the first thing he did is he went out there and he collected wheat. From what I can gather, he pulled it off the stem with his hands. And he just went out and he collected some wheat, doing it that way for about an hour, and he stacked that. Then he went out with an old style sickle. He put together a sickle that was comparable to what people were using at the time. And he did that for an hour. And he concluded that a small family group working for 3 weeks could collect more wheat than they could possibly eat in a year. So they didn't have to farm. They're called affluent foragers. And so this area was just perfect. You had the wheat that the people could eat, and other barley and other grains, and then you had herds of animals that are living off of these same grains, and they're coming through seasonally, and you're killing them. They didn't have to farm. And so it destroyed the whole farming first paradigm. The idea is that you had to start out with farming, and then you'd settle down, and then after you settle down, you create a hierarchy, and then you can get organized and you can construct something like Gobekli Tepe. Turns out, no. So they're building Gobekli Tepe, and they're harvesting all this wild grain. They get organized, they settle down, they get the hierarchy, they build Gobekli Tepe, and then at about the time that Gobekli Tepe was abandoned is when they actually started farming.
So the link that I was talking about to the origin of farming was that they were using the wild grain that all modern grains basically are derived from.
Yes.
Okay, so there are people who are still wondering, probably where I was, a decade or so ago, what the hell is Gobekli Tepe?
It's an amazing site when you look at it and think about it. It's like 1,000 feet across, round. It's instantly recognizable as an artificial structure. And it's up on a mountaintop, so it's got this fantastic view to areas all around. And when they first found it, they were saying that it was probably some sort of temple. But the reality is now, again, Jens was big on this, it's more of a gathering place. So I imagine something between Burning Man and a county fair. And it looks like they were brewing beer. You're going to say something?
I was going to say that in either case, I think temple still applies. Just basically what we're talking about, because I didn't provide an illustration for this. Gobekli Tepe is a roundish structure with like stairs, if I remember correctly, that descend down, and there are pillars going around in what would be the typical temple kind of structure. And then they have rather nice, especially for how old they are, animal carvings in all of these temple columns.
Yes.
Okay. What other detail? Because I'm just going by pictures.
There's some stairs. The way I always describe Gobekli Tepe, it's like multiple Stonehenges all adjacent to each other. It's massive, and it's at least twice as old as Stonehenge is. And twice
as old.
Yeah.
Okay. So the dates that I had were for Gobekli Tepe was that it was about 11,000 years old.
Yeah, so the oldest date that they have is actually for the fill material. So how old Gobekli Tepe actually is, nobody's really sure at this point. Klaus Schmidt, he was thinking that it might be 15 to 14,000 years old. The oldest date that they've got from carbon-14 dating is for the fill material that they used when they backfilled the enclosure. So that's the oldest date that they have at this point. But it's older. How much older? They didn't just build this thing right away and then fill it in. That's most likely not the case.
So if 11,000 years was the correct date, then that's only like 500 years after, let's say, what was it, the Younger Dryas event, right?
Yeah, so everyone is, especially the conspiracy theorists, are tying everything in with the Younger Dryas. And so, Hancock will tell you that there were 2 comet impacts. One at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, and that caused this ancient civilization to be destroyed, and it's tied in with Noah's flood and Atlantis and yeah, I don't know what all. I'm losing track of all of that. And then at the end of the Younger Dryas, so where this civilization was for 1,200 years, we don't know. At the end of the Younger Dryas, they come into Gobekli Tepe, and they do a technology transfer. They bring in megalithic architecture. But the reality is it looks like they've been doing that for 1,000, if not 2,000 years already at that point. So they be like, well, thank you very much. We've been doing that. And the other thing that they brought them, according to Hancock, was farming. But they never used the farming because they didn't need to use the farming. The first evidence of farming comes very close nearby. It's at a place called Navali Kori. And the farming goes back about 10,400 years. And you can tell that they started farming because the seeds are changing. When you're domesticating a crop, you're going to pick the best seeds and grow those. And so there's like 5-10% of the seeds that no longer detach from the wheat at Navali Kori. So we can see the signature that farming had begun there. And you don't have that signature at any of the seeds that are found at Gobekli Tepe. Getting back to one thing I wanted to make real clear, the reason they don't like calling it a temple anymore is because a temple implies a priest or some sort of spiritual leader. And they're not sure that happened. That's a level of understanding that they don't have at this point.
Well, I can understand why you would do the association with Burning Man then.
Yeah,
That's more of just a casual gathering place.
And what's interesting is when you start looking at the different enclosures, each enclosure is dominated by a particular set of animals or animal. So in one it's birds, in other ones it's foxes, another one it's boars. There's depictions of other animals, but they're just primarily that. So what I'm wondering is, we have here the badgers at the UW take on the gophers up in Minnesota. So I'm thinking it's something on that order, that you're in that particular clan, and then so this is the particular enclosure that you're going into. And I wonder, thinking about why these enclosures were buried, I wonder if a particular group didn't fall out of favor. And that, the boars can't come here anymore, and they no longer even have a place to go to. Because one of the big mysteries is, why would they fill it in? And the other thing is that in some places there were stairs, but most of the entrances are thought to have been through the roof. And so Gobekli Tepe was originally roofed. All the more recent depictions will show it that way. And the entrance was through the roof. Well, if you've got kids running around at this festival and some kid falls through and falls 18 feet through a roof, you're going to say, hey, maybe we could solve this by filling that enclosure in that we're not using anymore. I had another reason why I'm trying to remember what it was. There's a third reason why the enclosures, I can't remember right now, may come to me. So it's not that mysterious. There's reasons why you might want to fill in these enclosures. And the conspiracy theorists, pseudoscientists, whatever you want to call them, they're always, trying to pull out that that mysterious thing. How do you explain this? Well, and they're not going to listen.
Yeah, in the last year or so, I've taken a number of classes in archaeology and anthropology, and there was a couple, actually 3 or 4 archaeology classes, including human migration, and one of them was pseudo-archaeology. And at first I was like, why am I taking a class in pseudo-archaeology? Believe me, I'm really fluent in all the pseudo-archaeology stuff. And of course, it dealt with the word, I don't know what other people think of when they hear Younger Dryas, but I mean, it does connect to all kinds of lost civilization nonsense, where they bring up Atlantis and like everything, and where people think that 10,000 BC was an accurate depiction of paleo history and so on. It's embarrassing for me for my species how much nonsense we buy into just because it's something we want to believe.
Boy, you bring up so many things. The one thing, let me start with this. So when you look at temperature at the end of the last ice age, you'll see that, yeah, there's this dramatic drop in temperature at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, and then at the end of the Younger Dryas, it pops back up. They never mention the bowling rod. And there is an equally large increase in temperature at 15,000 years ago. And is that another comet? they never explain it. They always just seem to ignore the fact that, you know, there was an ice age and then it got warm. But they don't talk about how quickly it got warm. And then they talk about the Younger Dryas and the huge significance of that.
Well, then maybe I'm confused. Isn't the Younger Dryas the act of getting warm? I mean, was like the very end period? Was that the coldest part of the ice age succession? Was the coldest ice age, and it ended abruptly, like 11,500 years ago.
So the Younger Dryas is about 12,000. I'm trying to remember the years, and that was caused by a dramatic drop in temperature. And what caused that? The most likely guess, they always throw out comet impacts and solar flares, God knows what, but they never bring up the one that's, and nobody's sure, but the one that it's most likely thought to be is a release of fresh water from the glaciers as they were melting, covering the ocean water, and that cut off the downwelling of the water, because this lighter water is floating on top, and so the world, it turned off the Gulf Stream and other ocean currents, and that caused the world to drop back into glacial conditions for about 1,200 years.
Just remember that the people who criticize explanations like that are the same people who also say that homosexuality causes earthquakes.
Sometimes. I think that's taking the creationist thing a little too far. Like I said, I don't think Hancock or Schock or any of those people would say anything like that. And I don't think most of the followers, but at the same time, they do play. These pseudoscientists are playing to the creationists and such, because if you can find science is wrong in something, if it's wrong about the age of the Sphinx, if it's wrong about Gobekli Tepe or can't explain it, well, then what are all the other things that they might be wrong about? And so the creationists kind of...
Well, the purpose of science is to figure out where we're wrong.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question here?
Sure.
It seems to me that you're making 3 points. The first point that the rock was soft, so maybe it's not as eroded as people think it is over time. Is that the point?
Yeah, so the rock itself was soft, which the geologic term for that would be weathered. So the rock was actually weathered. And a lot of confusion. That's a really good point. There's a lot of confusion on that. So people have asked me the question, how could the Sphinx possibly have weathered before it was even carved? So weathering, it happens in situ. You don't, the rock, if they ever carved it into the Sphinx or not, would still have been weathered by acidic groundwater. And so erosion is what happens after the rock is exposed, and the elements, be it precipitation or the wicking groundwater or wind-blown sand and things like that, they're going to erode it. So there's some questions on that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it wasn't eroded over 12,000 years. It was already eroded when it was carved?
Yeah, so it was eroded over millions of years.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah, so the rock was deposited, from what I can gather, almost exactly 40 million years ago. There's a kind of a unique event. Do you ever hear of hyperthermals? I never heard of these.
Are you talking about like warming?
Yeah.
Periods? Like
so the biggest hyperthermal when I was doing this, honestly, I got to tell you, I was kind of disappointed when I was doing my research and I found that the Sphinx was deposited, the rock was deposited during the Eocene. And to me, I did some work on the Precambrian. You know, that's where the really cool stuff is. And nothing's happened since the demise of the dinosaurs except the slow rise of the mammals. Isn't that it? And that was my picture of Earth, even as a geologist. And so I started looking at the Eocene, and then knowing that these rocks were deposited 40 million years ago, but how do you separate the Eocene from the Paleocene, the geologic time before that? And it turns out that there was an event there called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And the low end of the release of carbon dioxide or methane, the low end would be all known fossil fuel reserves on Earth. The high end is up to 3 times the known fossil fuel reserves. And I'm going, how come I never heard of this? And I spent months just doing nothing but learning about hyperthermals and find out that this didn't just happen once 56 million years ago, that there's a series of these hyperthermals that have occurred. And what happens is the oceans become so acidic that limestone can no longer form. And what happens is the clay that was there all along is the only thing that's being deposited. And it's that clay that is far more resistant, because it doesn't have much limestone in it, to weathering by acidic groundwater. And so that's the high. And so then I'm looking, spending this, and I thought, I'm wasting time on the Sphinx. I'm not wasting my time learning about hyperthermals. And I went back to look at the Sphinx, and I pulled out this old photo, and I looked at it and I said, oh my God, no pun intended, there's a hyperthermal exposed in the Sphinx.
Explain what that means. What do you mean by that? Because we're throwing out words here that I realize that there are people in the audience that have no idea what we're talking about. And you've got some critics in here, by the way, which may not surprise you.
No.
Let me see. All right. So there was somebody that said that you were off on some new published stuff, and I'm sure in the comments below or by some other means you can contact me. Let me know what the inconsistencies are. But when you say that there's this thermal, I watched part of your presentation that you gave about this, and I didn't understand myself what you meant by that. So can you please explain that to me?
So for some unknown reason, there was this massive release of carbon dioxide to Earth's atmosphere. What caused it, no one really knows. It has a carbon-12 excursion. So what that means is when plants use carbon, they preferentially take carbon-12 because it's lighter. And so they concentrate carbon-12 in their tissue. And then if you were to take that tissue and burn it or release that in some fashion, it's going to have far more carbon-12 than would be naturally occurring if this was started by, say, a comet. So there's this huge, and that's what they first discovered, was that there's this huge amount of carbon-12 that suddenly appears in Earth's atmosphere. And everyone's like, where did that come from? So the geologic period, it's between the Paleocene and the Eocene. And so that was, I forgot who did that, but that was like 150 years ago. They made that designation. Just
now,
like the end of the dinosaurs, they're saying something happened. We didn't know until recently it was an asteroid impact, but they're saying something happened.
But you said the Paleocene and the Eocene, you were talking about the thermal maximum, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, that's a different event. But and if the influx of carbon-12, I would have thought that would have been a result of fires.
It could be. It's almost certainly because the volume, nobody knows at this point really what it is. But the volume of it, so yeah, some of the thoughts are it could be fires as the Atlantic was opening up, and there are a lot of peat deposits in the northern hemisphere, and those were like a permafrost, and now they're being released as they're warming, and then some of that peat is being burned by the tectonic activity, volcanoes as the Atlantic's opening. Nobody's really sure. There's a lot of different.
Is the point we're making here that during this thermal maximum, that's where the rock that formed the head of the Sphinx came from?
Exactly. But not the PETM.
Okay.
It's called the Middle Eocene Climatic Optimum.
Okay.
And so that's a distinctly different event. That happened almost exactly 40 million years ago.
And there are less limestones in the head, so it is less susceptible to erosion than
exactly.
Because in the body, if everybody thinks of the Sphinx, you can see the body, you can see the different sedimentary layers, because whatever was coating it was taken. You were saying taken off and used somewhere else, but also you can't see that in the head. You can't see the sedimentary lines of the sedimentary lake.
You can still see bedding in the head, and in fact, that gets back to one of the other things that I know I'm going off on a tangent, but they're always saying that the Sphinx doesn't look like any of the pharaohs. And you can see that they use the bedding planes. There's a bedding plane at the eyebrow, there's a bedding plane at the nose, and there's a bedding plane at the lips. And they use those. And so the proportions of the face were set by those bedding planes. So you can still see the bedding planes, but they're not that softer rock that was weathered. It's what was called the upper building stone. It's most of the area in Giza, that all of that rock was stripped and mined and used to build the pyramids. And the only place where you find that, there's one other spot, but principally the only spot you find that layer still existing in situ is the head of the Sphinx. Other than that, the whole area has been mined clean of that.
I should give a shout out to Louis Smith, made a donation over there in the super chat. Thank you very much for that. And on the thing about when I said I took a pseudo archaeology class, one of the things that they required me to do in this class was not just read all of these preposterous stories, like what was the origin of Atlantis, for example. And I was surprised to find out just how trite an origin story that was. It's like a partial mention in one book by Plato or something, and just people have just added all these other details to it. Right, you get this one sentence which doesn't work, one or two sentences which don't really imply anything, and then other people have just glommed all this other stuff. So I was required to watch an episode of Ancient Aliens, which I'd never seen before. And I'd seen the meme of the guy saying aliens with the weird hair, but I didn't know where that was from until I was made to watch this episode. And he was describing how Atlantis was an Independence Day sized flying saucer that landed in the ocean and became an island and then left. Like that's an awful enormous leap. To just like no information to flying saucers. Brilliant.
Well, you know what? You made me think of something here, which was the reason I bring up the hyperthermals. Also, the Sahara has been going through these green periods. So every roughly 20,000 years, the Sahara turns green for about 10,000 years. And it's this green savanna, and there's people living there. And it contained the world's largest lake, almost 5 times the size of Lake Superior. And I was sitting there in Africa. And what we're doing is we're envisioning lost civilizations, because that's the way our minds work. And nature is coming in and saying, no, no, the Sahara is green. If somebody tried to say that the Sahara was green, we'd be like, oh yeah, how does that happen? And nobody even imagined it. It's like relativity. It's like quantum mechanics, and it's like evolution. Our minds are not designed to understand the natural world. It's difficult for us to do this. And these stories of Atlantis and lost civilizations, that's easy. That's the way our minds work. And that's the stories that they're selling. But the reality comes through, and it's like, what the hell is that? What's a hyperthermal? Can the Sahara really turn green? It's just like, this is mind-boggling. But we now know for a fact that happens.
I try to consider history to be sacred, that you shouldn't like be changing the story, for dramatic effect. If you're doing somebody's biography, and yet look what we do to it. I mean, the story 300, for example, was, there's a brilliant part of history, where 300 people stood up against this huge army and everything, and that should be remembered, but for what it was, not for an 11-foot tall god. And for all of the other things we threw in. But that's what people do. I mean, we embellish all this other crap because it makes it a better story. And my favorite of these type of embellishments is when we say, well, we can't make it about this guy because nobody knows who this guy is. So let's say, this other big person is much more famous. Let's say he's the one that did it. Let's make the story about him, and it'll sell a lot better. And
no, I get that. I'm trying to write a book. The word is trying to write a book on the Sphinx, and tentatively one on Gobekli Tepe, maybe. And I'm trying to center it around people, because people like stories about people. And So yeah, I don't know if I should. I'm not even going to go there. I don't want to go down that path because I haven't talked to that person yet about putting them in the stories. So I don't want to mention them right now. But I'm trying to do that for that very reason, because we like stories about people. And if you can come up with an emotional story that is related to the facts, that's a big sell. And I think that's why these pseudoscientists are popular, is because they're telling stories that people can relate to and stories that they want to hear.
Yeah, I look at 10,000 BC and I don't see a lot that I can relate to.
I've never seen it. I'm just looking at my notes here. I want to make sure that I'm covering the things that I want to cover. Are there any questions that you? Oh, I know.
On Gobekli Tepe, my knowledge of that is very small. So are you saying that they built an enclosure before they built the Sphinx?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So the Sphinx was about 4,500 years ago. Gobekli Tepe, hard to say where it really begins. 15, maybe 14,000 years ago, for sure. By 12,000 years ago, and then it ends about 10,000 years ago.
That was used as a temple, or what was
Gathering
the
place?
I'd say more of a gathering site. There's evidence of them brewing beer, and in fact, harvesting of wheat might have more to do with brewing beer than it does with making bread.
That's awesome. You did. Someone, Alios000 says, how do you explain the alignments with Leo based on the precession that would put the Sphinx closer at the same time as Gobekli Tepe?
Yeah, so what this person is asking is that, so the Sphinx faces due east. And what's really sad is what it's looking at today is a Pizza Hut. If you went there, you'd be like, come on. And so it's facing due east. So it's always going to be aligned with some celestial, at sunrise. But I'm not sure at what time of day that it would be most important as what constellation is there. But the pseudoscientists are saying it's got to be Leo because it was a lion. It supposedly had a lion's head to begin with, and so it's looking at its own image on the horizon. And part of that ties into the fact that then if you were to look off the shoulder, if I have this right, you're going to see the Orion, the constellation Orion, and they're saying that the three pyramids align with Orion. I've tried this several times. I need to get to somebody who's going to point out perhaps the error in my ways, but I've tried it like 3 times, and every single time I take the first star in Orion and in the order that the pyramids were built, and the smallest one last, and I'll put the 2 lines together, straight lines, so of course they line up. The third star of the Orion belt doesn't even fall within the small pyramid, let alone a line. So it's at first glance, it kind of looks like it does. And if you're going to take the first star and the last one and kind of fudge it in a little, you can kind of make it align. But if you do it as accurately as possible, and these ancient aliens, they were doing it accurately. They were within 10 inches and they were aligned perfectly. So, all these alignments, I don't understand. What they did was, years ago, they found some really cheap software that you could put on your computer and say, what would you find here? And then they're drawing grand conclusions from that. I don't have much to say on that because I'm not an astronomer and I haven't looked at that, but I don't see any cosmic significance. There's no reason. Something's always going to align with it. Today and in the past.
I've seen plenty of people who say things like, if you use your imagination, then you can see how this lines up, which means pretend. Just pretend that it lines up. Or as you say, fudge things, because we've seen plenty of that, of people fudging things so that it defends the faith.
So it's really interesting. Whenever you see these alignment with Orion, you'll see all the stars are just points, as you'd expect stars to be. And then when you look at the stars of the Orion belt, my God, there are these blurry, huge, bright things. And it's like, no, if you actually took a photo, they've doctored that photo to make it look that way. If you actually go out there, you've got perhaps Orion behind over your shoulder there, and you get the actual points. You go, oh no, this doesn't line up at all.
So the way that the stars line up behind my wife's shoulder has some huge significance that we'll have to write a book about and get rich. Do we have any other?
There's another question on that.
Sure.
Would Leo as a lion even be an Egyptian constellation? That's from Clive Wells.
Yeah, the odds of it being a constellation 4,500 years ago, that's the same as ours. I don't know. I mean, I went to Egypt and they took us to get some hieroglyphic art and stuff. And they said, well, we'll put your name down here. We'll put your name in hieroglyphs at the bottom. And I'm just laughing because I'm like, the odds of there being a one-to-one relationship between the letters in our alphabet and hieroglyphs is zero. But somehow they're going to convert my name by spelling it out in hieroglyphs. It's like, no, I don't think so. One of the things I wanted to talk about was the Hall of Records. Are you familiar with that at all?
No.
Oh my God. The Hall of Records. So this is John Anthony West again, and this is Edgar Cayce. Do you know Edgar Cayce? You do. I had no idea about any of this. So Edgar Cayce was the sleeping prophet, and he could go into a trance-like state, and he could diagnose your medical issues anywhere on the planet. He was, I'm surprised you know, because he was Ra-Ta. He was one of the principal builders of the Sphinx. He was there in a previous life, but he's also a good Christian and taught Sunday school. So in a previous life, he was there. And what happened is when Atlantis was destroyed, they knew this was coming. So what they did is they took all of their information and they decided to store it, even knowing that it was going to be destroyed at Atlantis. Okay, so that was a loss. But they duplicated it someplace in the Yucatan Peninsula, and that has yet to be found. And the third spot is below one of the paws on the Sphinx. That's where the Hall of Record is. Mark Lehner, the guy who was studying the Sphinx, the guy who was on Nova, he went there with that very purpose to prove that the Hall of Records exists, and he was funded by the Edgar Cayce Foundation. And they drilled it. It's actually been drilled several times. But Schock and these conspiracy theorists, they never mention that they've actually drilled it. And Schock will tell you that, so he used seismic refraction to discern, to delineate this. He needs to write a paper on this because there's no way that seismic refraction could map a low velocity zone like that. If he's doing this, we could have used this to find underground storage tanks. There's so many different applications. So he used a method that can't possibly be used to find the Hall of Records and found the Hall of Records. He said he was chased off the site and the Egyptian government won't allow them to drill without ever pointing out it's already been drilled. And so this and the thing is that it's underwater. So here's this really smart civilization who can align everything up and do all of this and know about, you know, the floods and all these different things. And they're so stupid that they put the Hall of Records underwater with papyrus scrolls. They're not going to last.
Well, I've seen arguments that there's a stone carved road or a series of stone carved bricks in the Caribbean that are underwater, and these were supposed to be evidence of the lost civilization of Atlantis as a flying saucer now. And so now, how could it be this hyper advanced city when you look at these stone structures and they do look to be symmetrical? Because there's a lot of, you know, as a geologist, there's a lot of geological formations where you have rectangular blocks.
Yeah, columnar jointing sort of thing.
Yeah, there's natural processes where you get something that looks vaguely equivalent to a strip of brick wall. And so you have some of this in the Caribbean, and it's obviously natural. I mean, some people insist that it was carved, but even if it was carved, how could it have been a spacefaring race if you have these crude stones, you know, the Stone Age architecture at best? If it was man-made, how would that be? How would that imply flying saucers? I mean, there's a huge leap there.
There's a huge leap, and that's where I'm saying it's easy to come up with that kind of a story. I call that the usual suspects that they come back with, or maybe they're the unusual ones. So it's lost civilization, ancient aliens, the Loch Ness monster, things of that sort. Things that they always go to, and it's never once been that. And then they're calling you on the fact that you're closed-minded because you're not going with this. And like, well, when was it ever that? That's been proposed countless times, and it's never once turned out to be the case. Why is that the go-to answer?
We're going to have to close up here momentarily.
All right.
Lilandra, do we have any more questions from the chat?
There are 4 or 5. They're not too difficult.
All right, let's go through.
Kakaro donated and asked that Bob, have you ever met Kent Hovind?
No, I've never met Kent Hovind. Why?
Oh, well, that's that you were talking about creationists. He's like the granddaddy of creationists.
I do have to say this. What I've done in doing this is I've met a lot of interesting people. I met with Mark Lehner, the guy I saw in Nova. I met with him twice, once in Boston and once in Cairo. I met with a friend of his, Matthew McCulley. He's an interesting person. I've had contact with Scott Wing at the Smithsonian and Farouk Elbaz. Do you know who Farouk Elbaz is?
I do not.
He taught the astronauts that were in orbit around the moon to observe the moon. He's this Egyptian geologist. So I've had reason to contact him. Everyone has been just so nice. And I've met a lot of people doing this that I never would have met had I not meeting you, the two of you. I mean, but I haven't met Kent Hovind, no.
Okay, next question. Igalext1 asks, I know a few people who think the pyramids were cast as opposed to built with carved stone rocks. Can we prove the pyramids were built, and if so, how?
That's an interesting question. So there's some talk that they were actually like concrete. So limestone, you grind it up, you can turn it into concrete, But no, I mean, you'd look at it and you can see the bedding in the rocks. That one would be very, very easy. And in fact, the interior of the pyramids, from what I know of them, they're not these nice smooth blocks. They get pretty rough at places, and it's only the exterior where they went back to using really nice blocks.
Right,
okay.
Next.
What fossils do you find in the rock of the Sphinx?
Oh my goodness. Who's asking that?
What fossils? Let me see. I saw you were talking about that too, to date the Sphinx, that there are fossils.
Yeah. So the fossils, it's really interesting. So the fossils that's wonderful. The fossils that are on the Sphinx are called Nummulites gizihensis, and it's a Nummulites, which is this coin-shaped creature. It's the largest single-cell organism that ever lived. Not the ones in particular that are exposed in the Sphinx. Some of these would be up to 2 inches across. They were single-cell creatures that lived to be up to 100 years old. And and what they do is they're these little coils, and they kind of look like snails, but very, very fine. And they contain the record as they grow. They take in Earth's atmosphere, and they can show you the carbon-12 excursion. And it turns out that same fossil that's in the Sphinx is Menin, which is one of the Egyptian gods. It's their snake god. And even more than that, it's a game. It's one of the oldest board games is based on the fossil that's found in the Sphinx. And so you would roll your dice, or you throw these sticks, and I don't know exactly the way that they fall, the number that they cross, and then you would take and move your piece. And they're not sure exactly how this game was played, but you can find the board game for Menin. And I remember trying to find this when I was in Egypt. Nobody ever heard of it. But it turns out that particular fossil, Nummulites gizihensis, goes extinct at the beginning of the Middle Eocene climatic optimum. So the moment that fossil, and hyperthermals, these creatures, these Nummulites, are very susceptible to changes in ocean chemistry. So when these hyperthermals occurred, they caused an extinction of that particular animal. And yeah, good question.
I got to give a shout out to Glass Monster and Adam Wright. Thank you for donating as well.
Okay.
Do we other questions?
I didn't get who got this question, but don't you think it's impossible to use copper chisels for carving on such a massive scale? You did talk about the stone hammer type things, but
yeah. So the copper chisels were just used for the detailed work. Most of the carving was done by taking harder rocks and pounding them onto the surface. There were other ways in which they would cut things. They would drill holes by putting sand down at the bottom and drilling down that way. There was various methods for them cutting it, but principally the carving was done by flaking the rock off with harder rocks.
okay. And this is a kind of a Sphinx head question, and I have a question about that too. Jen with one N says, was it Napoleon's army that denosed the Sphinx?
No. Napoleon actually, he would be very disappointed. I don't know what the word. He actually conducted the first scientific study, or he had one of his generals do the first scientific study of the Sphinx. Somebody a long time ago, and the guess is it was somebody, because there's chisel marks where on the nose where somebody put in a chisel and broke the nose off.
Well, that's just another surprise, because that's one that I believed. I'd been told, forever that there was a couple of Napoleon's men that, fired a cannon, knock off the nose, and they thought it was a great joke, and that Napoleon had them both put to death.
No, Napoleon went there. He was really, I'm not a Napoleon expert, but he was really enamored with Egypt, and he would never have destroyed anything like that.
No, it wasn't that Napoleon wanted it done. He wasn't involved in it at all. Nobody did that.
Okay. And my question about that, I think you were talking about this in your presentation. The head of the Sphinx has always been like that. It was never another carving or larger.
Yeah, so there's a lot of people. Robert Schock is always asking that, making that comment. It turns out that layer that was deposited is too thin. So if you look, you can tell how thick that layer is because it slopes down, and it's too thin a layer. If that layer were thick enough, they would never have to have quarried limestone from across the river. So the layer, and you can just clearly see this. And so it's actually a very soft layer that was in the geologic layer above above what the Sphinx was carved from. So it was way too soft for it to ever have been carved. That's an impossibility. The head couldn't have been larger. The other thing is that there's a fracture that occurs just at the back. If you look at old photos, I was very disappointed when I went there. I wanted to take a picture of this, but they filled it in with concrete. And there's also another fracture right at the front. So it was the size of a fracture-free block of limestone, and by the thickness and the size of it, that's what set the scale of the Sphinx. And the reason that the head is too small for the body is this acidic limestone actually creates caves and things. And there's actually, and solution cavities. And there's actually what you could call a cave was formed and discovered when they excavated to carve the Sphinx. And so there's a huge area. It's called the Major Fissure. And it's like, I don't know, 6 feet wide, if not wider. And so because of that, they couldn't put the rear paws where they wanted, and they extended the body. So the head is not too, and Mark Lehner is the one who pointed that out a long time ago. So they didn't, it didn't once have a bigger head to explain why the body is disproportionate. The body was elongated for that very purpose.
And somebody else, I saw a question that was by DJ Adam 21. How did they move the stones in Baalbek when, 2,000 pounds or whatever, when we can't do this now?
So, yeah, so they always have this where, they bring in a crane operator and they ask, could you lift the stone? And this is a ridiculous question because nobody ever lifted those stones. They dragged them. And we know that because there's depictions, there's hieroglyphs that show how they moved large objects. And so you can see a bunch of people on a rope. There's somebody standing pouring water at the front. And I'm thinking they lubricated it with the very mud that was deposited by the Nile, and they dragged these things. So yes, you couldn't pick it up today. That is true. They couldn't pick it up back then. They didn't. They dragged them, and it's well within the capability. And so the biggest piece that they dragged is part of what's now called the Sphinx temple, which is directly in front. So when the Sphinx itself, I didn't say this, is actually carved below grade. And so it's a quarry, and what they did is they left this remnant in the middle of the quarry, and from that remnant, they carved the Sphinx. So there's sidewalls that go down, it's flat, you got the Sphinx, and the blocks, they dragged them forward and constructed part of the Valley Temple and part on the Sphinx Temple, and you can tell by the layers that they came from this excavation. And you can also tell that the Valley Temple and the Sphinx Temple are tied in with the pyramids there, and it all dates to 4,500 years ago. That alone is enough to prove that the Sphinx isn't older, because unless they stashed these rocks for some, I don't know, 7,000, 8,000 years someplace, and then decided to use them. And then they used them last. They didn't even use them first when they built it, because there's two temples right there. Anyways, I went off on a tangent.
Yeah, I think that what you started with was a question. I think you started with a question I just saw that came up. How do you explain the rain erosion in the Sphinx enclosure itself? Didn't you begin with that?
Yeah, so, conceptually, yes, I did. And so it's not precipitation erosion. The thing is that again, is an impossibility. So you have to think about, conceptualize what was going on. So if it were not for tourism today, the Sphinx would be buried in windblown sand. And it would not erode. There's no way that you're going to get erosion. The only way, and you will see it if you've got an intense rainstorm now, because we've got bare rock for tourism, you'll see that it comes in and it will cut. But what it also doesn't do is it doesn't cut hardest at the bottom. When water comes over a waterfall or flows down, it's going to cut hardest where the debris that it has in it is cutting out the bottom. That would be the floor of the Sphinx excavation. And there's nothing there. There's no plunge pools at that point. So it's clearly not precipitation that caused that. And if you look at some of the, I know it's one of the slides, but if you look, there's actually a huge concrete patch at the neck. And the greatest degree of erosion anywhere on this, what they're calling erosion, erroneously calling erosion, occurs at the back of the neck. That would have been protected from precipitation by the head itself. You don't see that today because it was like in the 1920s, they patched that with concrete and they tapered it in nicely. But look at these old photos. There is no way that could possibly be erosion by precipitation. Okay. Just impossible.
Okay. I think you might have talked about this too. Is there something inside the Sphinx?
No, that was one of the slides I put on just to make sure that we didn't use. No, there's all these people, and there's a thing called the Dream Stela, and it probably was a door, according to some people, and it's placed between the paws of the Sphinx. So it looks very much like there's a doorway between the paws, and then you've got the nonsensical stuff about the Hall of Records beneath. The Sphinx is made out of solid rock. There are several holes in the Sphinx. There's one at the top of the head. I don't know how deep that goes. I know very little about that. There's another one that's called Paring's Hole or something like that, and it was put in like the 1880s. They were drilling down through it, and they even got their drill rods stuck in it for a while. So there's a small hole on the back, and that's got like a metal plate over it, as is the head. And then there's another boring at the tail end, at the rump of the Sphinx. And that one is really telling because it looks like it was carved from the top down using methods of carving from 4,500 years ago. And it goes all the way down to the water table. So it goes down about 15, almost 16 feet below the surface. And it's been speculated that maybe there were treasure hunters that were looking for treasure. It's been speculated that some rich person wanted to be buried in there. I forgot what the third explanation is. I look at it and I know exactly, as a geologist, that's a geotechnical boring. Before you take on a project like the Sphinx, you're going to go out there and you're going to put in some borings. You're going to say, what exactly are we dealing with at this point? And the reason that ended up in the Sphinx is because of that major fissure, and they pushed the body back. And so it's covered with block. And again, it makes no sense. If you were going to be looking for treasure, why would you go right behind these blocks that are there and carve down? And then there's a way in. You can just move a block and go in and then go all the way down to the water table. And it doesn't go anywhere. When they're doing all these ancient aliens, lost civilization things, they keep showing that this leads somewhere. It doesn't lead anywhere. It goes down to the water table and it stops. So I think it was a test boring.
Okay.
But that's it. That's it for holes.
All right. And somebody said, the Iron Charioteer says there are some theories out there that say that Mount Sinai was actually the main pyramid in Egypt. And what do you think? The Bible describes it as such?
I don't know. I mean, so one of the things when you look at the Bible and you look at, I think you like this. So when you look at it, supposedly the pyramids were built by slaves. And, there was some talk now that they should tear them down because they were built by slaves.
It was my understanding that they were not built by slaves.
They were not built by slaves.
Okay.
And so the only place that you find any discussion of the pyramids having been built by slaves is in the Bible. It doesn't exist anyplace else. I always describe Moses as God's imaginary friend. I mean, none of that happened. Those are not true stories. Just because a lot of people...
It's like what we said before about, taking a popular story and then attaching it to a more famous person because the story will sell better. And the stories that we now attribute to Moses were actually based on a handful of different people.
So what's really interesting is the Sphinx. I didn't even think of this till this moment to bring this up. The Sphinx is Horus, and Horus is, and you should maybe look into this, but there's strong parallels between Horus and Jesus. Half virgin, born of a virgin, half God, half human.
I don't know I don't think any of that was confirmed. I mean, I've heard a lot of that, but I've talked to a couple of experts about it, and because I never happened across it myself, the all of the parallels they were talking about. So I don't know that those parallels actually exist or that they're confirmed.
They do to some extent. My cousin married somebody who studies comparative religions, and he said that Horus is and Isis, it's Virgin Mary and Jesus. I mean,
yeah, somebody Luke Chouse says, nope, this is my specialty, and no, and then the scroll, and no, this is not true.
And what happens is that it so quickly gets to the absurd where you start saying, okay, there's some kind of loose connection here. And then the next thing you know,
it's not Horus, it's Osiris.
Could be. This is not my area. I don't believe any of it. I mean, so but the point being is that, I mean, he said that. I still remember when he said that, and I was like sort of surprised, and it was an awkward moment, so I didn't take it any further.
It was a very popular, I want to call it a meme, urban legend or whatever that was spread around for a long time. But and I would have bought into it, but I'd already seen other claims that didn't hold out or didn't pan out. So there was a book by Kersey Graves about, I think it was called 16 Crucified Christs, and he made a lot of claims in there. And I just happened to note across one of them that I knew was not true. And so I investigated in depth on the others and found out that there was precious little in that book that had any credence at all.
I'd have to agree. Most of what I saw when I looked into it, I'm like, well, no, that is definitely not the case. Is there something there? Perhaps, but most of what I've read clearly isn't. And it was just based on one comment.
Yeah, and one last thing we're going to throw out there, because I was going to mention this before, somebody just brought it up. Iron Charioteer mentioned it again. My education was so amiss when I was a kid. I mean, one of my family members, I remember when I was 12, gave me a book by Eric von Däniken, or maybe the one that gave me was The Chariots of the Gods, and I don't remember if that was Eric von Däniken or his friend at I forget what the other name was. But this was my education. I'm being taught all this wrong. Space aliens and time travelers from the future going back to South America to make these really crude runways that are why.
Do you remember Kids in the Hall?
Yes.
So there was one scene, I don't know if I remember it exactly, but the aliens were on their lunch break and they were complaining about their job. Like, why are we doing this? We're going out, we're collecting humans, we're giving them rectal exams, wiping their memories clean, and then
we're mutilating cows occasionally.
Yeah. I think guy's like, I went to college for this. I mean, what are we doing? I got to get a different job.
There are like just two questions, and we miss Goodwill Thinking and LVLO42. Thanks for your donation. But someone asked ARON to ask, how long does Bob think the Sphinx is likely to last now as it's exposed to erosion? And, I think you were talking about climate change and the Nile maybe covering it again. But eventually it will just become a concrete block if the Egyptians simply fill in gaps with concrete.
Now, what's going to happen to the Sphinx? It depends what happens first. So we've got climate changes occurring, and this, like I said, the Sphinx is only 66 feet above sea level, but the river, the ocean doesn't have to come up 66 feet. The Sphinx is like sitting here, and so if the ocean comes up about 15 feet, it's going to lap because the Nile is going to respond to the ocean levels as it goes up and down. And so so right now the Nile's at 15 meters, about 45 feet. And if it goes up just a little bit, it'll be lapping up and it'll wash out everything in the Nile Valley. At the same time, the next Green Sahara period's coming. What happens is it's because of the pseudoscientists should love this stuff because it's all based on the precession of the equinoxes. And so what happens about every 20,000 years is right now our winters are on our closest approach in orbit around the sun. So as we get to the sun and we're at that close point, we're pointing away from it in the northern hemisphere. What's going to happen in about 10,000 years or so is the northern hemisphere will be pointing towards the sun at the hottest, at the closest approach. So our summers will be slightly hotter and our winters will be slightly cooler. What happens then is the air over Europe heats up and you get extra hot air rising. This is an oversimplification, but you get hot air rising and that hot air is replaced by air down below, and that draws the monsoons over northern Africa and turns the Sahara green. And when it does that, all this water gets funneled down the Nile. Rivers that are dry now will be flowing. A lake 5 times the Lake Superior will reappear. And all that water is going to be funneled down, and Cairo and the Sphinx and everything there will just be washed into the ocean. And that's why it can't be older. So I saw Randall Carlson was on Joe Rogan, and he was explaining how it was Lake Victoria that overtopped to send all this extra water down the Nile. No, that happened through the Green Sahara period, the very precipitation that they're talking about that has eroded the Sphinx. That is the very reason why the Sphinx Valley, the Nile Valley was uninhabitable, why the Sphinx couldn't possibly be older, because if it were there, as it is now, we know that at times it's been flooded. If the Sphinx actually were that age, if it had existed anytime between 12,000 to 5,000 years ago, it would have been washed out to sea. So they proved themselves wrong. And he's thinking that's all because of the overtopping of Lake Victoria. But all that water evaporates in a giant swamp called the Sud. And just a few hundred years before that, Lake Tanganyika was disconnected from the Nile, and that reduced the flows. But none of that really matters. There was the Yellow Nile, known today as Wadi Harwar, and this sent all this water down through the Nile and flooded the Sphinx area. So the very precipitation, the very floods that they're saying is the flood that they're part of, because they use all different dates, is proof that the Sphinx cannot be older. And like creationists, you point that out to them and it's not going to settle in. They're going to still find some way to make that work.
So,
One last one. What
okay.
Egyptian king is speculated to have built the pyramid?
Excuse me?
What Egyptian king is speculated to have built the pyramid? And how about let's throw the Sphinx in there too?
So I should know this. I'm not an Egyptologist. I mean, they each had their own pyramid, and there was like the first pyramid. Sometimes the very first pyramid, the guy had like 3 different pyramids built for him. And he's like, nah, I don't.
They had more than that, because they had the sloping pyramid, and I know that there was like one guy, and I can't remember which pharaoh it was. One guy did like 3 pyramids because he didn't like the first 2.
Yeah,
and we're not talking about the Great Pyramids. We're talking about some like.
This is like the first pyramid, so that would be the step pyramid, then the bent pyramid, and then I've got what the other one is. Yeah, I'm not an Egyptologist. I should try to force myself to learn that. I'm a geologist more. I don't. So what they're all doing is they're playing on this thing, and there's books on it called Egyptomania. So if you present anything that has anything to do with ancient Egypt, people just love it. And what I found, what's really kind of cool is, I'm not sure how well I'm doing it right now, but I found that you could teach people almost anything in terms of geology, anything on science, as long as you relate it to ancient Egypt. So if I've tried telling people something about seismics or paleomagnetism or hyperthermals and things, and it falls on deaf ears. Start out by talking about the Sphinx or the pyramids, and they can't get enough. I don't know why.
But any conversation that starts out in Egypt ends up with reptilians from the Sirius star system who have adopted human guys and have infiltrated the government to control the Illuminati.
So I almost said it earlier when you said that. I remember a movie, and I thought it was so silly I had to go see it. The ad was proof positive that creatures from other planets are using our skies and oceans as a cosmic playground. And that was the actual ad. Of course, I went to the movie and they didn't have any proof.
Is there any good theories about who built the Sphinx and why?
Yeah, so it's pretty well, again, I should know this. I don't want to misstate anything, so I'm going to be quiet. But no, the Egyptians know who built the Sphinx. It's tied in with the pyramid. It's Khufu. Or Khafre, one of the two. I should know. I'm too busy working on other things. But they know. I mean, there's no question. The Egyptologists, and the only reason that there's any question here, and it is kind of odd, is that there are no hieroglyphs. There's no mention of the Sphinx until 1100 years after it was first carved. And how reliable is that? I mean, think about 1100 years. According to the conspiracy theorists, it should be great because the civilization survived for 1200 years during the Younger Dryas and for thousands of years in other places, going back to who knows how far. But no, 1100 years, it's taken all with a grain of salt. And everyone is pointing to that and saying, you'll see the conspiracy theorists and say, this is the only evidence that they have on who built the Sphinx. It's like, no, the proximity to everything else is what sets who made the Sphinx. It has nothing to do with the Dream Stealer.
We're going to have to close up. It has been like an hour and a half, and I want to thank you very much. Each of our interviews with scientists tend to run long, and I guess it's just because I enjoy the topics. But I want to thank you very much, Robert Schneiker. Schneiker. Sorry. Yeah, and I'm big on trying to pronounce people's names correctly because nobody ever gets mine right.
Aaron. They always call him Aaron instead of Aaron.
Yeah, and they spell it that way too. Even I get return emails where they just add an A because they think I don't know how to spell my name. All right. Well, thank you for being on.
Thank you.
Yeah, include. Let me know if you want me to tack any links into the description. I'd be happy to do that. In the more info, if there's anything you want me to addend, whatever.
And your projects, you said you were writing a book, and is there anything else?
Well, I gave a presentation at the Free Thought Festival here back in March. And so one of these days, once the university lets students back, that you should be seeing that available. It's on Gobekli Tepe. That was the very first time I'd ever given that presentation, so it's not the best. But they invited me to do it when I went there to see if I could rehearse. And they're like, why don't you do this? So you can look for that. But yeah, working on writing a Sphinx book, and I've got some articles I need to get published, scientific articles on the Sphinx.
Okay. All right. Well, Mr. Schneiker, why is that tough for me? Thank you very much for being on. I'm going to go ahead and close it up.
Thanks
you
for
for everybody
having
in the
me.
super chat and so on.